In early April shows student Kayshawn Wade restrained by two police officers and taken into a room off camera. Principal Murray is seen walking in and out of the room. Hollis claims Wade was then punched in the face by Officer Shawless. Superintendent Alan Johnson says the incidents do not represent a pattern.
Body slammed from inside the main office of a Louisiana middle school has two officers facing serious charges.
Incident shows a school resource officer putting a student in a headlock before pushing him down and then later using a taser. Vladimir Duthier of our streaming network CBSN has the school's response.
Hello, my name is Elliot Johnson. For my project, Criminal Students, the reason why I chose to do Criminal Students because when I was a young child, I was chastised, mistreated, targeted. These same schools that treat African American kids so bad, they say that these schools are places where kids can learn. But from what I see, kids, these schools are nothing but prisons. Come and take a trip with us as we expose these schools for what they really are.
My name is Dr. Kendra Gage, and I am an assistant professor of African American Studies at UNLV. I received my PhD actually from UNLV, and my master's in undergrad from the University of Oklahoma. So what we see happen is really with the 1960s race riots, we see an entrance of more police officers into the school system, and they'll call them different things. They'll call them school security, they call them many different names, but we know what they are. They're school police officers. They're meant to arrest and charge kids with crimes that follow them all the way through. So what we see that happens from the 1960s is we see harsher suspension sentences too against students of color as a whole. We see this with African American and Latino students in more considered higher population areas, Las Vegas, Los Angeles, New York City, Boston, those particular areas where suspension rates increase, and they come up with really draconian suspension rules as well, very similar to the 3 strikes and you're out type of policies that we see get implemented in schools too. So they could be minor injustices or minor rule infractions, but because they've had 3 of them, they're suspended from school. And we know from looking at the scholarship that suspension of children for school isn't positive. It doesn't lead to them changing their behavior or to them liking school. It actually leads to quite the opposite, where children then really hate school and they don't see it as an opportunity or process that fits what they need. But the push out takes a couple of different forms. So one type of push out is that redirectioning that I talked about before, where students, instead of being put into college preparatory classes, are put into trade and vocational programs. That really limits their opportunities because they're not put into those college preparatory programs. A lot of students too aren't asked either what route that they would want to take. They're just automatically put into those particular routes, or if they go meet with a counselor, they're told, oh, no, nobody from this school has gone to college, so therefore you must go this particular route. So they're kind of pigeonholed into that. So that's one type of push out, because you're pushing them out from ever attaining higher education. It's increasing that educational gap. The second type of push out is the suspension, where there's so many suspensions that students, when they get to a certain grade where they can leave, they just decide to leave. And then I think the third type too, and I've seen this more and more, is when a school can't address certain different types of learning difficulties. And so instead of addressing those, they kind of push them out in that way too. And I've seen a lot more of that in recent years, where they call it like either a behavior or a learning difficulty, and they say we just can't address these. happens? It does stem back actually to Brown, because once we see the passage of Brown, and then once we see the passage of the Civil Rights Acts of 65, 68, is that people think that there's an equal playing field. Say everything's done, we've ameliorated, everybody has equal opportunity, particularly too when you have affirmative action policies that are passed. They say, okay, well, not only have we given you an equal playing field, but we've kind of given you an extra, little extra to reach that. And that's arguable at best. I've always talked about this, that the people who benefited the most from affirmative action were like first generation white women like myself, and it doesn't actually contribute to what it was set out to contribute to. But because of this false notion that there is an equal playing field, is that once they start passing kind of stricter standards and rules within schools, they're no longer saying and looking at it and saying, well, we're practicing discrimination against students here. What we're doing is we're checking behavior.
At the end of my interview with Dr. Gage, she specifically mentioned zero tolerance and as a way to push out kids, African American kids and African American females. Later on in the video, I will explore what push out was for girls. But push out for boys and the criminalization of boys could start with zero tolerance as well. Zero tolerance was implemented in the 1990s. And what we had with zero tolerance, it was a way to suspend boys for gun violence, fighting, or drugs. But what happened is with zero tolerance is that it has suspended kids for minor infractions, just maybe mouthing off or maybe having your cell phone. And what we see with zero tolerance is we see a pattern where kids aren't even given a chance to explain themselves and they're suspended at high rates, basically be expelled, where you have criminals or people that commit crimes outside of schools, where if they're on a zero tolerance, they're giving much more leniency. As a matter of fact, to go along with that, in 2016, the Yale Student Law Report quoted as saying teachers, when they looked at videos of students acting up, their gaze would gaze upon African American students, not white, not Hispanic, not Asian. They would gaze upon African American students. So you can't sit here and tell me that criminalization does not exist in the schools. You just can't tell me, because it does exist. Obviously, you're gazing at kids and they started to commodify their bodies like it was slavery. They started commodifying their bodies as they're criminals, comparing them to grown men. Kids aren't grown men. Kids shouldn't be treated as grown men. But this is what we were seeing. They're seen as grown men. And matter of fact, the kids aren't necessarily seen as grown men. What they see with the black body is they see the black body as either entertainers, as in actors, or athletes, and they don't see them as kids, as a chance to get educated, as they're smart to use their brain for what they're put in school for. Before Monique Morris came out with Push Out, all we saw was about the criminalization of African American boys. That couldn't have been the only thing. When she published Push Out, or when she produced her documentary in her book, we saw explicitly how African American girls were criminalized in the school system. 16%, she contended, 16% of African American girls made up the school district. 31% of them were subject to suspension or law enforcement. Not only that, she contended as well that the school districts had a responsibility to train and teach these girls. Train and teach. It's not always on the parents. Furthermore, when these girls were getting in trouble, it seemed to believe that the parents believed them, believed the school district that was criminalizing these kids. But where Monique Morris failed to mention was the psychological effects that criminalization has on African American girls and African American boys. She was spot on to say, hey, African American girls are jumping through the same hoops, are getting chastised for their hair, are getting targeted for their behavior, are getting targeted just for their skin tone, and are treated as they are adult women, and coming into school and getting treated as it is prison. But where she failed was she did not say, hey, what is the effect that this has on the minds of African American girls, or the effects that it has on African American boys? That's where my documentary dig deeper. I interviewed Dr. Matoya, a professor at UNLV, to ask her what were the effects What were the psychological effects of chastising
Actually, I'm
African
a
girls
clinical
and boys?
psychologist. I went to UC Irvine, and my specialization there was artificial intelligence. I was focusing on the neurosciences. I was actually the first black woman, black person to ever get a degree in the social science department there when it was just an open field. Well, I'm really interested in identity formation, and I think your identity is formed primarily. I know that all theories kind of find this to be a consistent fact. Your personality is formulated by the time you're age 7, right? And so the family structure, the community kind of determines the kind of person you're going to be, and also your personality, literally by age 7. So when boys primarily reach latency age, they have a certain idea about themselves that they've either learned from their families or from society, but primarily from teachers. So if teachers begin, we know that when I was at UCLA, we did a study on school desegregation, and we found that teachers had biases that were unconscious, which is a real problem. They don't call up black kids. The darker the skin, by the way, the less you get recognized in classes. Usually you're blamed for the problems that a teacher has. Like if there are two kids interacting, if there's a black kid involved, they would almost always send them to the principal's office or punish them or discipline them. So you can imagine over time, if you keep being identified as a kid that's a problem, you're already labeled at that time. And so your self-concept gets injured. And you tend not to respond, or you get angry about it, and you respond to adults as enemies. And teachers aren't seen as allies because they keep seeing the negative or stigmatizing the behavior of the black kids. And so that's when it all starts, and that's when the pipeline begins. Well, guess what we found? Black kids tend not to have as many personality disorders as other groups. What they have are what we call character problems. You know about that in psychology, access to issues, which means that they're reacting to their environment and to how people behave to them. The core, you don't get narcissistic personality disorders or neurotic behavior as much in black kids because they're always reacting to their environment and how they're perceived. So what you do get, like when you give them psychological tests like the multi-phasic personality test, the MMPI, and those kinds of tests as they get older, they tend to develop what's called a hypervigilant stance or perception of the world. They're always on guard. They always expect negative outcomes. And what happens is you become reactive. We're seeing a lot of that, and we see in some of these incidents of racism and bigotry and biases in our society. Black kids and black teenagers tend to expect people to do bad things to them. So we're always on guard. And that ends up being resulting in what we call epigenetic stress, traumatic stress disorders, where there's physiological manifestations. You see black people, black kids developing physical problems that they shouldn't have, obesity, all of the physiological issues that we have in our community have a psychological component, and it's a response. And that study is significant because it also gave us information about how blacks internalize hatred. What we end up doing is what's called emulating the aggressor. The Jews did that in the concentration camp. You know, they'd over-identify with the aggressor, hoping that they would get more access and their lives would be spared. Well, symbolically, we're doing the same thing. The more you try to be white, hopefully they'll accept you more, right? And so what we end up doing is hating each other. So we come up with all these terms about people living in the ghetto and all the language. That's why I tell people don't pay attention to the language that you use when you talk about each other, because you're internalizing that. It seems not to matter, but words are very impactful. And kids, by the way, internalize that. So if you have a family member, let kids explore that initially. And you may even overdetermine it, because remember I said between the ages of 0 and 7, your personality develops. And never use negative terms towards a black child or corporal punishment. Now you can say, I don't like your behavior, but never say you're a bad person. There's a distinction there. You know, kids have to learn how to behave, but you never tell them that they're bad because of their behavior. You have to model assertion. You have to model, you always assume that your child is right, regardless. You start from that perspective and confront the system in that way. So it's a socialization process that black parents have to go through as well. And that, going back to the 60s, we started, the Association of Black Psychologists started parenting classes to teach black parents how to advocate for their children. So the problem, you keep saying your father didn't have a back. Well, he hadn't learned how to confront these systems in a way that was productive on your behalf. And that's learned behavior as well.
I don't think he ever did. So me and him, now me and him, we'll go back and forth for hours just based on this knowledge and stuff. And I'm like, I'll be like, Dad, you're wrong, blah, 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 blah. I can send you, what I've read, this, that, and the third. Oh, no, this, that. And I'm like, okay, you know what, it's cool. Now, my mother, on the other hand, she was in the forefront, but at that time I was living with my father. But my mother, on the other hand, she was on top of my IEPs. She would look at the teachers and say, okay, you're wrong. I mean, and for years, I think she was a social worker for like 20 years before she started working in the school district. In some cases.
I think they're both. You have I can remember 3 or 4 teachers that really transformed my life, right? And then there are others that were incompetent, but also they policed the classroom. And it depends on how they see themselves, right? It's just, if they feel that they're disciplinarians and they're there to control instead of educate, then you're going to get a certain kind of behavior out of them. And it's important for parents and children to identify those people as either allies or enemies in a way. Because you don't want your children to internalize that belief about themselves that they need to be policed. And so the system, it's beyond the teachers. The system is set up to institutionalize kids, and that's why the pipeline exists, right? Kids are socialized to be alienated from the learning process. So the options that they have are often to act out, which leads them into corporal punishment or either juvenile justice system. And once they do that, there's studies that show most black kids get in trouble because of the warrants that they have. When they're teenagers, they don't pay warrants, they get things warrants out of them. And then they have a record which gives them a system of permission to label them, to stop them, and it's basically on simple infractions. And teachers do the same thing. Once they've identified you as a child that has problems different than those police officers. I saw those tapes of...
Is this a school or a prison yard? Alex Patelli contended, and one thing that I have left out this whole video is how school systems are reliant on cops, or as they say, school resource officers. But really, they might as well just be cops. How about this? 49% of school districts nationally have school resource officers, quote unquote, that aren't cops in the district. What do these officers do? Instead of protecting students, basically they criminalize them and arrest them. Not only that, studies showed by Alex Patelli that schools that had no SRO officers had less suspicion rates of African American kids and girls. Not only that, since Columbine, we've seen an uptick in school resource officers. Instead of focusing on things like depression or bullying that kids might be going through, they seem just to hire more paramilitary police and put them in schools. Weird. That's why we're here to educate the kids and teach them something better and try to help them. But when we bring them into school, all it does is heighten the suspicion rate. So as far as I'm concerned, are they helping the kids? Or are they just getting a fat paycheck to criminalize them? What if I told you that when kids are suspended, some of the effects of them being suspended, they fall behind. They're pushed out the classroom. They come back. They're behind on their schoolwork. Then these same kids that were suspended by the teachers that are supposed to be role models target these kids intentionally, try to get them suspended more. Like this is some cat and mouse game. Are you grown adults or you kids yourselves? It makes you wonder. But what if I also told you that these kids, they stigmatize this? They stigmatize how these teachers are teaching them and treating them and say, wait, am I the problem? And if I'm the problem, why doesn't anybody else act like this? Is there any hope for this kid? These kids start to feel like there is no hope for them. They start to feel like, since they are being treated so bad and criminalized, that this is just normal. And deviancy, as sociologists like to say, just seems to be the natural behavior. And for some of them, or for most of them, they either dabble in drugs or suspended from school, end up with criminal records. All from coming to school. All from school that is supposed to teach. But what schools are really doing are criminalizing them. They're not teaching these kids. That prisoner pipeline is real. Special thanks to Tarza Jones, my editor. It was a real appreciation for you helping me do this video. I also want to thank Dr. Gage and Dr. Matoya for their insightful information that I used in this video. Also for this video, I used Push Out by Monique Morris. I used the book and I used the documentary. And also for this video, I also used Alex Vitelli, The End of Policing. What a great book, I might add. And also I used School Suspension and Adverse Experience in Adulthood by Casey Wolf and Aaron Kupchak. I hope you guys all enjoyed this video. Thank you.